The unbelievable wake-up call. The sound of a door creaking open broke the silence of the night. Mark stirred in his sleep, turning over to glance at the clock. It was 2:47 a.m. He had been sleeping soundly until now, but the noise was enough to pull him out of his dreams. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering haze of sleep. His house had always been quiet at night. Mark liked it that way. He lived alone in a spacious home that was filled with the quiet hum of an old furnace and the occasional sounds of the wind outside. He had recently hired a new housekeeper, though he hadn't yet fully gotten used to her presence. She was quiet, polite, and kept to herself. But tonight, something about the situation felt wrong. The door to his bedroom was slightly ajar, and in the dim light of the hallway, Mark could just make out the silhouette of someone standing there. It was her, the new housekeeper, Mary. But what was she doing here, so early in the morning? Mary? Mark's voice cracked a little, unsure of what was happening. Mary didn't respond at first. She just stood there, her figure frozen in the doorway. Mark's heartbeat quickened. Something wasn't right. Why was she here in the middle of the night? He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as an unsettling chill ran through him. "Mary?" he repeated, his voice more demanding this time. Finally, she stepped forward into the dim light, and Mark could see her face clearly. She looked different somehow. Strange. Her eyes were wide and intense, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was as though she hadn't slept in days. The woman standing before him was not the same housekeeper he had seen during the day. This was something else, something unsettling. "I need to talk to you," Mary said in a low voice. Mark frowned, the confusion growing. "What's going on? It's the middle of the night. Why are you here?" She stepped closer, and for a moment, Mark could have sworn he saw something flicker in her eyes, something otherworldly, almost unnatural. "You don't know the truth, Mark," she said softly. "It's time you learned." Mark felt his stomach drop. What was she talking about? Truth. What truth? "Listen," he said, sitting up straight in bed now. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Mary's gaze hardened, as if she was trying to figure out how much to reveal. "You don't understand yet, but you will soon enough. The time has come for you to wake up." Mark's confusion deepened, and an uneasy feeling spread throughout his body. Wake up? From what? She took another step forward, and Mark felt an overwhelming urge to get up to run. But he couldn't. Something about her voice, the way she spoke, seemed to trap him in place. It was as though her words were pulling at something deep inside him, something buried. "You were never supposed to know. But things have changed, Mark. You can't stay here anymore. Not after what's coming." Her words sent a shock through his body. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that he couldn't form the words. His mind raced, trying to understand what she was saying. What was she talking about? What was coming? "I don't understand. You're not making sense," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. Mary stepped closer, now standing at the edge of the bed. Her breath was quick, as if she was afraid of being overheard, though there was no one else in the house. "Listen to me, Mark. You're not human. Not the way you think you are. You're something else. Something they made." Her words felt like a slap in the face. Not human. What was she talking about? Mark's mind couldn't grasp what she was saying. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate. He wanted to laugh it off, to call her crazy, but something in her eyes, something deep and unsettling, kept him frozen. "Maid? What are you talking about? I'm just..." He stopped himself. The words felt wrong. The way she said it, the way her voice echoed in the room, made him feel like he was on the edge of some horrible revelation. Mary didn't give him time to think. "The people who raised you, they're not your real family. You were placed there. And the life you think you've been living, it's all a lie. You were part of an experiment, Mark. A dangerous one. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Mark's thoughts were racing, each new piece of information more unbelievable than the last. An experiment. A lie. What kind of experiment? What do you mean? Mark's voice was barely above a whisper now. He couldn't believe what she was saying. He didn't want to. Mary's eyes softened for a moment, but the fear was still there. You have abilities you don't even know about. And now, the people who created you are coming for you. You need to get out. Now, Mark's heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of joke, right? But Mary's face didn't change. She wasn't playing around. Get dressed, she said quickly, turning away. We don't have much time. They'll be here soon. For the first time in his life, Mark felt a deep, overwhelming fear. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. He needed answers, and whether he liked it or not, he was about to find them. The housekeeper's shocking revelation. Mark sat there, frozen in disbelief, as Mary's words echoed in his mind. You're not human, she had said. The words felt like a heavy weight pressing against his chest, crushing the air out of his lungs. His thoughts spun in chaotic circles, trying to make sense of the impossible things she was saying. What are you talking about? Mark finally managed to say, his voice shaky. I'm not human. That doesn't make sense. Mary didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked across the room, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. Mark watched her, trying to understand what was happening. She moved with a strange, almost mechanical precision, her eyes never leaving him, as if she was studying his every reaction. She stopped by the window, looking out into the dark night as though she was waiting for something. Then she turned back to him. I know this is hard to understand, she began, her voice calm but firm. But it's the truth. You're not who you think you are. You were part of an experiment, a project that was kept secret from you. The people who raised you. They weren't your real family. They were just caretakers, placed there to keep you safe. Mark's heart raced. His head felt light, as though he might faint from the shock of it all. His whole life, the memories, the people he'd known, the family he thought he had, was now in question. This is insane, he whispered, almost to himself. I don't understand. Mary walked back toward him, her face full of something Mark couldn't place, pity, maybe, or concern. You were engineered, Mark. They used advanced technology, something that's not even from this planet, to create you. You're special, Mark. In ways you can't even begin to understand yet. The word engineered hit him like a punch to the stomach. Special. He didn't feel special. He didn't feel any different from anyone else. And yet here was this woman, telling him he wasn't human, that his life had been some kind of experiment. This is a joke, right? Mark said, his voice cracking. Some kind of twisted joke. I don't even know you. How do you know all of this? Mary's eyes softened, but her expression was still serious. I know because I've been watching over you for a long time. I'm not just your housekeeper, Mark. I'm part of a group that's been protecting you from the truth, keeping you safe from the people who created you. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. It sounded like something straight out of a science fiction novel, but the intensity in Mary's voice made it feel real. Too real. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to yell, to demand that she stop lying. But deep down, something inside him was stirring. A part of him wanted to believe her, even if he couldn't fully grasp what she was saying. But why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would they do this? Why would someone create me? Mary hesitated for a moment, as though deciding how much to tell him. Finally, she answered, her voice quieter now. Because you're not just human, Mark. You were made to be more. You were part of an experiment to create a new kind of being, someone with abilities beyond what normal humans can do. The people who created you, they wanted to use you for something dangerous, something they knew could change the course of humanity. Mark's mind was spinning. Abilities. What abilities? He felt normal. He was just like everyone else. But Mary's words kept playing over and over in his head. You're not human. You're special. What did she mean? What was she trying to tell them? But I don't feel any different, Mark said, still struggling to understand. I don't have any abilities. I'm just me. Mary stepped closer to him, her eyes locking with his. There was a fire in her gaze, a sense of urgency that made Mark's pulse quicken. You might not feel it yet, but it's there. It's in your blood. Your DNA is different, and that's why you're in danger. Mark stood up from the bed, pacing around the room. Danger? From who? Mary looked at him, her face hardening with a hint of fear. From the people who created you. They'd been watching you for years. They know everything about you, and now they're coming. They'll do anything to get you back. And if they succeed, it could mean the end of everything we know. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He felt dizzy, as though the world was spinning faster than he could keep up. He had never been one to believe in crazy conspiracy theories, but something in Mary's voice, the fear, the urgency, made him realize that she wasn't lying. Where do I go? What do I do? Mark asked, his voice trembling. Mary didn't answer immediately. Instead, she grabbed a small metallic device from her pocket and handed it to him. It looked like a small remote or a key of some kind, with glowing symbols etched into the surface. This is a tracker, she said. It will lead you to a safe place. A place where you can finally learn the truth about who you are. But you have to go now, before it's too late. Mark took the device, his hands shaking. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was no longer what he thought it was. And whatever was coming next, he had no choice but to face it. Uncovering hidden truths. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the very walls were closing in on Mark. He stood there, holding the small device Mary had given him, the weight of her words still pressing down on his chest. He tried to make sense of it all. He was engineered. He wasn't human. The confusion swirling in his mind was too much to handle. What am I supposed to do with this? Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, his hands trembling around the device. The strange symbols on it seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, like they were calling to him. He wasn't sure whether to feel afraid or intrigued, but one thing was clear. His life, as he knew it, was over. Mary stepped forward, her face serious but soft with sympathy. You have to trust me. This isn't the time for questions. There's no more hiding. You need to go, and you need to go now. They'll find us if we wait too long. Mark's mind raced. Who are they? The people who created him. The ones who were after him now. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the fear creeping into his bones kept him silent. Where are we going? He asked, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. Mary's eyes hardened, and she glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting someone, or something, to be standing behind her. It's not safe to stay here. We have a safe house, far from here. You'll be safe there. But I need you to come with me. And you need to trust me, Mark. Safe house. It sounded so normal. But nothing about this situation felt normal. Mark had always thought he was an ordinary person, just like everyone else. Now he wasn't sure who he was at all. Why did you wait so long to tell me? Mark asked, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. Why not sooner? Mary took a deep breath, her eyes flickering with something dark. Because they were watching you, every step you took. We had to be sure you were ready to hear the truth. You weren't supposed to know until it was too late. Mark's stomach twisted. Too late for what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she motioned toward the door, her expression softening. We'll talk on the way. It's safer to keep moving. Mark hesitated, his heart pounding. He wanted to fight, to demand more answers, but the look in Mary's eyes told him there was no time for that. He didn't even know who to trust anymore. But one thing was clear. If he didn't follow her, if he didn't listen to her now, there was no telling what would happen to him. Taking a deep breath, Mark nodded. "Okay, I'll go with you." The housekeeper gave a small, relieved smile and turned toward the door, leading the way. Mark followed her through the hallways of the house that had once felt so safe, now seeming like a labyrinth of secrets. The walls that had once held comfort now seemed oppressive, like they were hiding something from him. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him was connected to something much darker, something he wasn't ready to face. As they reached the front door, Mary paused. "I need you to understand something, Mark. The people who created you, they didn't just want you for your abilities. They wanted to control you, and they will do anything to get you back." Mark felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. Control him. But how? What could they possibly want from someone like him? He didn't feel powerful. He didn't even feel special. He was just a regular guy. Mary stepped outside, glancing quickly over her shoulder. The night was eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. There were no sounds of animals, no wind rustling the trees, just a deep, unnatural stillness. "Do you know what's inside you, Mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" "The DNA," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. "It's not human. It was altered. They made you to be more than human. You have abilities, Mark. Abilities that will wake up soon. I don't know how, but they will. And when they do, you'll be able to do things that no one can imagine." Mark felt dizzy again. Abilities. Altered DNA. He couldn't even wrap his head around it. It sounded like something out of a science fiction story. But Mary's serious expression made him question everything he thought he knew. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why was I chosen for this?" Mary gave him a sad look, as if the question itself was a painful one. "Because you're the key. They chose you because of your potential. They were trying to create the perfect being, someone with the power to reshape the world. But they didn't count on you being different." Mark didn't know what she meant by different, but he didn't have time to ask. Mary was already moving, her steps quick and purposeful. She motioned for him to follow. "Stay close," she said, her tone urgent. "We're not far from the safe house, but it's better if we don't attract attention." Mark's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but he pushed them aside. Safe house. Escape. The truth. He didn't know what any of it meant, but right now, the only thing he could do was trust the woman who seemed to know more about him than he did. And with every step he took away from the house, the feeling that something huge was about to unfold grew stronger. The underground secret. The night was cold, the air sharp against Mark's skin as they moved through the shadows. Mary led the way, her pace brisk and purposeful. Mark had no idea where they were going, but he didn't dare ask any more questions. Not yet. His head was still reeling from everything he had learned in the past few hours. He wasn't human, he was part of an experiment, and the truth about who he really was still out of reach. They walked down a narrow path hidden behind the trees that surrounded his house. It felt strange to be leaving the place he'd called home for so long, but Mark knew he couldn't stay. Every instinct in his body screamed that something was coming, something dangerous that would stop at nothing to find him. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mary didn't answer immediately. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, scanning the area for anything that seemed out of place. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and urgent. "There's a place beneath this house, a network of tunnels. It's where we've been keeping you safe. But we can't stay here any longer. It's too risky." Mark's heart raced. Tunnels. Beneath his house. He didn't understand. He'd lived in this house for years, and there had never been any mention of hidden passages or secret rooms. Yet here was Mary, telling him that his entire life had been built around keeping him hidden from the world. "What do you mean?" he asked, struggling to keep the panic from his voice. How can there be tunnels beneath the house? I never. Before he could finish, Mary stopped in her tracks, her hand raised in a motion to silence him. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "Stay close," she murmured. "We're almost there." They reached a small, unassuming shed at the edge of the property. It looked like nothing more than a tool shed, its wooden walls worn and weathered by time. But when Mary moved toward it, Mark noticed something strange. The door, which had always been locked before, creaked open with a faint hiss, as though it was responding to Mary's touch. Without saying a word, she stepped inside, and Mark followed, his mind still trying to process what was happening. The inside of the shed was empty, except for a single stone circle on the floor. It looked like an ordinary part of the floor, but when Mary stepped onto it, a low rumble vibrated through the ground. Mark's heart skipped a beat as the floor beneath him slowly began to shift. The stone circle slid away, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the earth. "This is where you were hidden," Mary said, her voice now more serious than ever. "This is the place where the truth can finally reach you." Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he stared into the blackness below. The staircase seemed to descend forever, leading into the depths of the earth. He wasn't sure whether he should feel terrified or relieved. All he knew was that he was about to learn something that would change everything. As they descended, the air grew colder, and the silence felt almost suffocating. The walls around them were smooth stone, the kind of stone that looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. It was hard to imagine that this hidden world existed beneath the house he thought he knew so well. They reached the bottom of the staircase, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. The underground chamber stretched out before them, dimly lit by a series of glowing blue lights embedded in the walls. The room was large, larger than anything Mark had expected. It was a vast space, and in the center stood a strange, metallic structure. It looked like a giant machine, its design far beyond anything Mark had ever seen. "Welcome to the real world," Mary said, her voice now filled with a strange mix of awe and caution. "This is where everything started. The experiment, the technology, all of it. This is where you were made." Mark felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. He took a step forward, drawn to the machine in the center of the room. There was something about it that seemed familiar, even though he had never seen it before. It hummed with quiet energy, like a heartbeat, pulsing in rhythm with his own. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mary stepped toward the machine and placed her hand on its cold surface. "This is the core of the project. This is where the technology that made you, your DNA, your abilities, was engineered. The people who created you wanted to make sure that you were more than human, that you could survive in a world that didn't want you. They gave you powers, Mark, powers that will start to wake up soon, and when they do, things will change. For you, for the world." Mark stood there, his mind reeling. Powers, DNA engineered by people he didn't know. The machine in front of him felt like the key to a mystery he had never asked for, and yet, here it was, pulling him deeper into the unknown. "You're not just part of some experiment, Mark," Mary continued, her voice tinged with urgency. "You're the key to something much bigger. And the people who made you, they've been watching you. They've been waiting for this moment." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Waiting for what? Mary looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "They want to control you, Mark. They want to use your abilities for something terrible. And they will stop at nothing to get you back." A sudden noise echoed through the tunnels, distant but growing closer. The sound of heavy footsteps, and then a low mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Mary's face went pale. "They've found us. We don't have much time." Mark turned to face her, his mind spinning. What was happening? Who were they? What did Mary mean by all of this? But there was no time for answers. The footsteps were getting louder. "We need to go," Mary urged, pulling him toward the back of the room. Now, Mark didn't hesitate. Whatever was about to happen, he was in this now. He had no choice but to follow. A dangerous encounter. The underground chamber felt even more suffocating now, the air thick with the buzz of impending danger. The hum of the mysterious machine was drowned out by the growing sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnels, each step bringing Mark closer to something he couldn't quite grasp. Whatever was coming, whoever was coming, felt like a storm rolling in, and it was too close for comfort. Mary moved quickly, her hand gripping Mark's arm as she pulled him through the labyrinth of corridors. "We need to move faster," she said, her voice low but filled with urgency. "They're already here." Mark barely had time to process the words. They rounded a corner, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to close in on them, narrowing until there was barely enough room for both of them to squeeze through. The darkness was absolute, and the only sound was their hurried breathing, their footsteps muffled on the stone floor. He didn't know who they were, but the fear in Mary's eyes was enough to convince him that whatever was chasing them wasn't human. Or if it was something he didn't want to meet. Suddenly, the echo of boots hitting the floor grew louder, and Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He could hear voices now, too, low and gruff, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his stomach twisted with dread. "Who are they?" Mark hissed, his voice shaking. Mary didn't answer immediately. She glanced over her shoulder, her face a mask of determination. "They're the ones who created you," she said quickly, "and now they've come to finish what they started." A chill ran through Mark's veins. The ones who created him. He had barely wrapped his mind around the idea that he wasn't even human. And now, the people who had made him were here, coming for him. He didn't know what to feel. Fear, anger, confusion, all of it boiled inside him, making it hard to think clearly. "Where are we going?" Mark asked, his voice tight with panic. Mary stopped in front of a heavy metal door, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. She punched in a code on a small keypad next to the door, and after a tense moment, it slid open with a hiss, revealing a narrow room beyond. It was dimly lit, the walls lined with rows of strange equipment Mark had never seen before. Cables, monitors, and flickering screens, all connected to the machine in the center of the room. "Get inside," Mary ordered, ushering him quickly into the small space. "We'll be safe in here for now." Mark stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. His mind was still spinning. What was this place? The high-tech equipment, the flashing lights. It all felt so out of place, like something straight out of a movie. Mary stepped in behind him, closing the door quietly and locking it with a soft click. She turned to face him, her eyes hard but filled with urgency. "Listen, Mark," she said, her voice low. "You need to understand something. They don't just want to control you. They want to use your abilities to reshape the world." Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Use me? For what?" Mary's lips tightened into a thin line. "For war. For domination. They know what you're capable of, Mark, and they'll stop at nothing to harness your power." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't know what abilities she was talking about. He still didn't feel any different from anyone else, but the way she spoke made it clear that whatever was inside him was something dangerous, something that could change everything. Before he could respond, the sound of distant voices echoed through the walls, getting closer by the second. There were more of them. He could hear the cold certainty in their voices, the way they spoke to each other as though they knew exactly where he was. They were getting closer. Mary moved quickly to one of the monitors, typing rapidly on the keyboard. The screen flickered to life, showing a map of the underground tunnels. She scanned it for a moment, her eyes darting from one area to the next. "They're closing in," she muttered, almost to herself. "We don't have much time." Mark felt his pulse quicken as the realization set in. They were already here. They had found him. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched Mary's fingers move swiftly over the keys. "There's a way out," she said, looking up at him. "We can make it to the surface, but we have to move quickly. It's our only chance." Mark opened his mouth to say something, but the sound of a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy boots stomping toward the door. "They're here," Mary hissed. "Now." In an instant, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a small, hidden door in the back of the room. It blended seamlessly with the wall, so well that Mark hadn't even noticed it until now. With a quick motion, Mary opened the door and shoved him through it. "Go," she urged, her voice desperate. "Run." Mark didn't hesitate. As soon as he was through the door, he found himself in a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls here were slick, and the floor felt unnervingly smooth beneath his feet. His breath came in short gasps as he sprinted ahead, hearing the sound of footsteps behind him growing louder. He glanced over his shoulder, his heart nearly stopping when he saw a figure emerge from the shadows. Tall, dressed in dark, military-style gear, with a helmet that covered their face completely. Mark's pulse raced. Who were these people? The figure didn't say anything. They just advanced, their movements precise, almost robotic. And they weren't alone. More of them were emerging from the tunnel, blocking the way. Mark felt a surge of panic. His instincts kicked in, telling him to run faster, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Mary was already ahead, moving like a shadow through the dark corridor. She turned a corner, disappearing from sight, and Mark followed, not daring to look back. He didn't know what was chasing them, or what they wanted with him, but one thing was certain: he couldn't stop now, not when the danger was this close. The escape plan. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls closing in tighter with every step they took. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps, the pounding of his heart ringing in his ears. The distant sound of boots chasing them echoed through the narrow passage, growing louder by the second. They were closing in. No matter how fast they ran, the soldiers, whoever they were, seemed to always be one step behind. Mary moved ahead of him, leading the way through the labyrinth of underground corridors. Her pace was steady, her body tense but controlled, as though she had done this 100 times before. Mark, on the other hand, felt like he was running blind, every twist and turn unfamiliar and filled with danger. He glanced over his shoulder again, seeing nothing but shadows and the flickering light from the tunnel's overhead lights. The silence in front of them was deceptive. It felt like a calm before a storm, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. "How much further?" Mark asked, his voice ragged. He couldn't keep up this pace forever, and the uncertainty was eating at him. The feeling of being hunted, of having no control over his own fate, was suffocating. Mary didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pushed open a heavy steel door that led into another narrow corridor. As soon as they crossed the threshold, she paused for a moment to listen, her eyes scanning the surroundings with military precision. Mark caught his breath, his senses on edge, as they slipped into the new passage. "We're almost there," Mary said, her voice calm but tight with urgency. "Just a little farther." Mark felt a strange sense of hope stir inside him, but it was quickly quashed by the sound of footsteps echoing down the tunnel behind them. They were getting closer, closer with each passing second. "What is this place?" Mark asked, his eyes flicking over the walls. Everything about this underground world felt off, unnatural. The sterile, clinical design, the hidden passages, the strange technology everywhere. None of it made sense. Mary didn't meet his gaze, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a safe house," she said quietly. "A place we've set up for people like you. People who need to be hidden. People who can't be found. People like me," Mark repeated. The words had a strange weight to them, like he was being included in a secret society he didn't fully understand. Mary stopped in front of a large rusted metal door, its surface covered with layers of dust and grime. She pressed a few buttons on a panel to the side, and the door creaked open with a slow, grinding sound. Behind it, Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. The room before him was like nothing he had seen before, a high-tech operations center hidden deep below the earth. Rows of computers blinked with life, their screens casting an eerie glow in the otherwise dim room. Large monitors covered the walls, displaying maps, encrypted codes, and data streams Mark couldn't begin to understand. "This is where we keep track of everything," Mary explained. She stepped inside, moving toward a large table covered with blueprints and documents. "This is our base of operations." Mark followed her in, his eyes darting from the screens to the strange equipment that lined the walls. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it certainly wasn't this, an entire underground network dedicated to hiding people like him. Mary moved to a control panel, her fingers flying over the keys. "We've set up a safe house on the surface, far away from here. It's equipped with everything you'll need to learn the truth about who you are." She glanced at him, her eyes dark with determination. "But it's not just about safety. You need to understand something, Mark. There's more to this than just hiding. We have to fight back." Mark's head spun. "Fight back? Against who?" "The people who created you," she said, her voice steady but full of resolve. "The ones who've been hunting you. They want to control you, Mark. They want to control your abilities. And we can't let them do that." His heart pounded in his chest as her words sank in. Abilities. He couldn't remember ever doing anything extraordinary. But the way Mary spoke made it clear that something inside him was different, something powerful. The very thought of it scared him. "They've been monitoring your every move for years," Mary continued, her fingers still moving over the control panel. "You've always been a target, but now that you're aware of the truth, things will change. We have a plan to take them down before they can use you for their own purposes." A flicker of fear crossed Mark's face. "How are we supposed to fight them? I don't even know what I can do." Mary turned to face him, her expression hardening. "You don't have to understand it all right now, but you will. In time, you'll learn how to control your abilities. And when you do, you'll be able to stop them." Mark didn't have time to respond before the doors of the room suddenly slammed shut. The sound of clanging metal filled the space, and Mary's face paled. "They've found us," she said, her voice tight with panic. "We need to move, now." Without hesitation, she grabbed Mark by the arm and pulled him toward the back of the room. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel that led further down into the depths. The urgency in her movements told Mark that there was no time to waste. They ran through the dark, narrow passageway, their footsteps echoing through the underground network. As they ran, Mark couldn't help but wonder just how much longer they could keep running. Would they ever be safe? Or was he already too far into this world of secrets, with no way to escape? Mary glanced over her shoulder, her expression grim. "We can't stay here any longer," she said. "We need to get to the surface and prepare. We'll be ready to face them. But first, we need to survive." The sound of footsteps grew louder behind them. Mark's breath came faster, his pulse racing. This was no longer just about finding answers. This was about survival. The final revelation. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as they sprinted through the narrow, winding tunnel. The faint hum of the underground complex faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of rapid footsteps that echoed relentlessly behind them. Mary was still ahead, her face a mask of determination. But even she couldn't hide the flicker of fear in her eyes. Whoever, or whatever, was after them wasn't far behind. "We need to keep moving," Mary urged, her voice strained as she glanced over her shoulder. "They're not far." Mark's mind was racing, but everything felt like it was moving too fast for him to fully grasp. Every answer he had gotten so far only led to more questions. What were his abilities? What was the truth about his creation? The sense of dread in the air seemed to grow thicker with each step they took. They reached another steel door, its surface scratched and old. Mary didn't hesitate as she pressed a few buttons, the door opening with a screech. Beyond it was a small elevator shaft, the walls smooth and stark, illuminated by dim emergency lights. Mark barely had time to register what it was before Mary pushed him inside. "We're almost there," she whispered as the elevator began its rapid ascent. The hum of the machinery reverberated through the walls, and Mark felt the familiar grip of fear tighten around his chest. He wasn't sure where there was, but he knew it was their last shot at survival. The truth, he thought. I need to know. The elevator jerked to a halt at the top, and the doors slid open to reveal an open expanse. The surface world. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over a landscape that seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. This wasn't the world Mark had known. Not anymore. Mary led him out of the elevator and toward an abandoned warehouse. The place looked decrepit, but Mark could tell it had been used recently. It was a temporary refuge, a place to regroup. "We have to make sure they don't track us," Mary said, her voice steady despite the tension. She tapped on the wall, revealing a hidden panel, and moments later, a wall slid open to reveal a small, heavily reinforced room inside. Mark followed her in, not sure what to expect. Inside, the room was filled with screens and monitors, much like the underground base, but this time there were only a few people scattered around, watching the screens with focused attention. They glanced at Mark and Mary as they entered but said nothing. Mary turned to Mark, her expression somber. "This is where we prepare. This is where you learn the truth." Mark blinked, trying to steady himself. "The truth." His voice cracked. "What do you mean? What truth?" She nodded toward one of the monitors. "Look at the screen." Mark stepped closer, his gaze following hers. The screen displayed a series of old news broadcasts, headlines about scientific breakthroughs, rumors of military experiments, whispers about a new generation of human-like beings. But it wasn't the headlines that caught his attention. It was the image of a man on the screen. A man he knew all too well. "That's my father," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. His mind reeled as he recognized the familiar face, the same one that had raised him for as long as he could remember. But there was something else, something darker in his eyes. The man on the screen wasn't just his father. He was part of something much bigger. Mary's voice interrupted his thoughts. "He's not your real father, Mark. Not in the way you think." Mark turned to her, confusion swirling in his mind. "What do you mean?" "Your biological father was a scientist," she said. "A leader in a secret project. He and a group of others created you, designed you, with the help of alien technology. Your DNA was altered, enhanced, to make you something more. They wanted to create the perfect being, someone who could change the world." Mark staggered back as the weight of her words crashed over him. I was part of an experiment." His voice shook with disbelief. He had always thought he was just another person, just another human. But everything was a lie. His life, his family, even his own identity. It was all fabricated. Mary nodded grimly. The project's goal was to create a new type of human, someone with abilities far beyond what regular humans could achieve. But your creators were not the only ones who had plans for you. There are other groups out there, groups that want to use you for their own purposes. Mark felt his world shatter, the reality of what she was saying sinking in. His father, the man he had trusted his entire life, was part of a grand experiment. He wasn't even human. He was the product of a twisted, ambitious plan to change humanity. And now Mark was being hunted, his very existence a threat to forces beyond his comprehension. "But why?" Mark asked, the question falling from his lips before he could stop himself. "Why me? Why was I created?" Mary looked at him, her face filled with a mix of sadness and urgency. "Because you are the key to everything. You have the potential to reshape the world, Mark. You have abilities you don't even know about yet, and when those abilities fully awaken, you'll be capable of more than anyone can imagine. But you can't let them control you." Mark looked at the screen again, at the face of the man who had raised him, the man who was part of this monstrous plan. He felt a burning anger deep inside, the desire to take control of his own destiny. He couldn't let them use him. He couldn't let them win. Mary's eyes softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. It's not too late. You have a choice, Mark, a choice to fight back. The truth is yours now, and with it, the power to decide what comes next. Mark's pulse quickened as the full realization hit him. He was no longer just running from danger. He was ready to confront it. He wasn't going to let anyone use him. Not his creators. Not anyone. We end this, Mark said, his voice strong, the decision clear in his mind. Mary gave him a small nod, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Yes. Now we fight. The battle was just beginning, and Mark knew there was no turning back. The truth had been revealed, and with it came the power to change everything.